Please take a deep breath and simply close your eyes for a moment. Try to remember the exact sound of heavy raindrops hitting a thick plastic raincoat as you pedaled your bicycle against the fierce Dutch wind. Or perhaps recall the warm, comforting scent of freshly baked speculoos escaping from a beautifully decorated tin box on the living room table. Welcome back to your childhood. Today, we are taking a slow, beautiful journey back to the Netherlands of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. We are going to revisit 20 completely normal rules and daily routines that shaped our early years. To the children of today, these practices might seem incredibly strict, completely foreign, or even absolutely absurd. But for us, they were the gentle rhythms of life. They were the unspoken laws that made us who we are today. By the end of our journey, we will remember a very special winter tradition that might just bring a tear of joy to your eye. So, sit back, relax, and let us travel back to a much simpler time. Before we begin our list, let us remember how time itself used to feel. Back then, time moved at a completely different pace. There was no rushing, no endless scrolling on digital screens, and certainly no instant gratification. Life was deliberately slow. We patiently waited for a television program to begin on a Wednesday afternoon. We waited for the milkman to arrive on our street. We waited for the ink to dry on a handwritten letter. Modern society often believes that without our current technology, our lives must have been empty or boring. But we know the absolute truth. Our lives were remarkably rich. Our days were filled with genuine human connection, the tactile feel of physical objects, and the safety of clear, unbreakable boundaries. The rules our parents gave us were not meant to restrict us, but to teach us patience, resilience, and gratitude. We learned to find deep joy in the smallest of things. We learned to value what we had simply because we knew how hard it was to get. Let us explore those beautiful memories together. Let us turn our minds back to the living room of our childhood. The clock on the wall would tick in a steady, reassuring rhythm. The smell of freshly brewed filter coffee would fill the air, signaling that the clock had struck 10:30 in the morning. This was a sacred time in any Dutch household, but with it came a very strict, unspoken law. When your mother brought out the beautifully decorated tin box of cookies, you knew the rules. You would hear the metallic scrape as the lid was lifted. Inside, you might see speculoos, or perhaps a crumbly butter cookie. The rule was simple, yet absolute. You were allowed to take exactly one cookie. Not two, not three, just one. You would carefully select your prize, feeling the rough texture of the baked dough, and then the lid would go firmly back onto the tin. The box was immediately returned to the cupboard. Today, in a world of endless snacking and overflowing pantries, this seems incredibly strict. But back then, it taught us something profound. We would take tiny bites, letting the sweet flavor linger on our tongues for as long as possible. We learned the value of restraint and the true meaning of appreciation. That single cookie tasted far better than a whole box ever could today. And now, let us recall the true freedom of our youth, which always involved two wheels. As a child, you cycled absolutely everywhere, no matter the weather. You would put on a heavy, stiff plastic raincoat that smelled strongly of chemicals and wet rubber. There were no bicycle helmets back then. Such a thing was completely unheard of. The rule was simply that you had to look out for yourself. You would sit on the metal luggage rack of your friend's bicycle, your legs dangling freely in the air, feeling every bump in the brick road. If you had younger siblings, they were placed in a small wooden seat attached directly to the handlebars. The icy wind would bite at your cheeks, making them turn a deep, rosy red. You cycled miles to school, pushing against the relentless headwinds that seemed to blow from every direction. Today, modern parents would gasp in horror at the thought of children navigating busy streets without protective gear. But for us, it was the ultimate lesson in independence. We learned balance, spatial awareness, and resilience. The bicycle was not just a toy, it was our passport to the wider world, and we cherished every exhausting journey. Let us step outside, into the neighborhood streets. After school, the only rule was that you had to play outside. You would grab a piece of chalk, a skipping rope, or a pair of heavy metal roller skates that strapped directly onto your normal shoes. The loud, clattering sound of those metal wheels on the pavement is a noise we will never forget. You would roam the neighborhood with your friends, completely unsupervised. You built secret huts in the nearby bushes and scraped your knees on the rough concrete. The most important rule of the afternoon was dictated by the city itself. You were allowed to play exactly until the streetlights flickered on. The moment you saw that warm, orange sodium glow illuminating the evening mist, you knew it was time to sprint home. There were no mobile phones to track our location, and our parents rarely worried. They knew the community was watching over us. The sudden illumination of the streetlights was the universal curfew. It meant that dinner was almost ready and the adventures of the day were officially over. It was a beautiful, natural rhythm that gently guided our childhood. Do you remember the distinctive hum of a heavy engine turning into your street? This meant the arrival of the rolling supermarket, a wonderful vehicle we all knew as the SRV wagon. It was a massive, boxy truck that brought the grocery store directly to our front doors. The rule was that you always helped your mother by running out to meet the driver. You would step up into the narrow, brightly lit aisle of the bus. The air inside smelled wonderfully of fresh dairy, cold milk, and newly baked bread. You would hand the driver a handwritten list and a few heavy silver coins. The driver knew everyone by name. He knew who was sick, who was celebrating a birthday, and who needed a little extra time to pay. It was a moving social club for the neighborhood women who would stand on the pavement in their aprons, chatting and sharing the local news. Today, we order groceries with a quick tap on a glass screen and they arrive silently in cardboard boxes, but we lost the warmth of the SRV man. We lost the joy of stepping into that magical rolling shop that smelled of fresh cheese and community spirit. Let us move into the weekend, specifically to the sacred Saturday evening ritual. This was the time for the weekly bath. In many homes, there was no luxury of a modern bathroom. Instead, a large, heavy zinc tub was brought into the kitchen or the warmest room in the house. Your mother would boil large pots of water on the stove and carefully pour them into the tub. The strict rule was that siblings had to share the bathwater to save money and energy. You would feel the rough, scratchy texture of a knitted washcloth against your face and neck. The unmistakable sweet scent of Zwitsal soap or green foam bath would fill the entire room. You would sit in the soapy water, scrubbing away the dirt from a week of playing outside. Afterwards, you were wrapped in a thick towel, your hair still damp, and dressed in clean, crisp pajamas. You would sit by the warm stove, feeling incredibly clean and deeply relaxed. In today's world of daily, endless hot showers, the concept of a shared weekly bath seems primitive, but the feeling of that Saturday evening purity, sitting comfortably in your pajamas by the heater, is a comfort that modern plumbing simply cannot replicate. And what about the highly structured rules of a Dutch birthday party? When you entered the living room, you did not just greet the person celebrating. The absolute rule was that you had to walk around the entire circle of chairs, shaking hands and congratulating every single person in the room. The room would be thick with the grey haze of cigarette and cigar smoke, as smoking indoors was completely normal and expected. On the small glass tables, you would find the ultimate party treats. There were neat rows of sliced liverwurst and blocks of young cheese, all pierced with small wooden toothpicks holding tiny paper flags. Next to them were bowls filled with salted peanuts and delicate, crispy toast rounds covered in egg salad. You would sip a small glass of sweet lemonade while the adults drank coffee and talked loudly over the music. The rigid structure of the birthday circle might seem terribly awkward to outsiders today. But it ensured that everyone was acknowledged. It forced us to look each other in the eye, to shake hands firmly, and to feel like we were all a vital part of the celebration. Let us reflect on how we were taught the value of money. Financial discipline was ingrained in us from a very young age. We did not have digital banking apps or instant transfers. We had something much more tangible. We had a youth savings account, often part of the famous National Savings Program. The rule was that a portion of any money you received for your birthday or from doing chores had to go straight into your savings. You would walk to the local bank branch, clutching a small, heavily stamped paper passbook. You would hand over your physical coins to the bank teller, feeling the heavy ridges of the guilders and quarters. The teller would carefully stamp your book and write the new balance with a dark blue pen. The promise was that if you saved diligently until your 18th birthday, you would receive a generous bonus from the state. This taught us profound patience. We learned that wealth was built slowly, coin by single coin. We learned to delay our gratification. Today, money feels invisible and fleeting, but back then, saving was a physical, deliberate act that filled us with immense pride. Do you recall the sheer anticipation of Wednesday afternoons? In our youth, Wednesday meant that school finished early. The afternoon stretched out before us like a vast, empty canvas. But the most important rule of the day revolved around the television set. Screen time was incredibly scarce. There were only 1 or 2 channels, and daytime broadcasting was practically non-existent. You would rush home, eat a quick slice of bread, and wait impatiently for the children's programming to begin. You would hear the heavy, metallic click of the television knob turning on. We would watch the test card pattern, waiting for the cathode ray tube to warm up. Then, the magic would happen. For a brief, glorious hour, we were transported to the worlds of our favorite puppet shows and friendly vagabonds. We all watched the exact same programs. The next morning in the schoolyard, every single child knew what had happened on television the day before. The strict limitation on television made every broadcast feel like a precious event. We did not mind the waiting. The waiting simply made the reward so much sweeter. Let us move to the kitchen table for breakfast, where another non-negotiable rule awaited us. The Dutch breakfast table is famous for its sweet chocolate sprinkles, a delicacy we know and love as hagelslag. However, the rule in almost every household was strictly enforced by our mothers. You were absolutely not allowed to start your breakfast with a slice of bread covered in chocolate. First, you had to eat a slice of bread with something healthy and savory. It had to be cheese, peanut butter, or perhaps a thin slice of cold meat. Only after you had completely finished that first, sensible slice were you granted permission to reach for the cardboard box of sprinkles. You would spread the butter thickly so the chocolate would stick. You would listen to the wonderful, rhythmic sound of the sprinkles raining down onto the bread. Of course, a few would always fall onto the plate, and you would carefully press your finger against them to eat every last one. This rule was our daily lesson in earning our treats. It taught us that duty always comes before pleasure, even at 7 o'clock in the morning. Think back to the absolute thrill of receiving your weekly allowance. Usually, it was handed to you on a Saturday or Sunday morning. It was often just a single, incredibly shiny coin, perhaps a small dime or a slightly larger quarter. The rule was that you could spend it however you wished, but once it was gone, it was truly gone. You would run to the local bakery or the magical candy store on the corner. You would stand on your toes, pressing your nose against the cold glass counter. Behind the glass were large, heavy jars filled with every colorful sweet imaginable. The shopkeeper would patiently wait as you made your agonizing choices. You would point to a licorice drop, a sweet strawberry candy, or a sour ball. The shopkeeper would use a small metal scoop to place them into a little white paper bag. The crinkle of that paper bag was the sound of pure happiness. You would clutch the bag tightly on the walk home, savoring the smell of spun sugar and dark licorice. We felt like the wealthiest children on earth, armed with nothing more than a single silver coin. Now, let us remember the strict discipline of the evening meal. Dinner was served at exactly 6 o'clock. There was no flexibility, and everyone was expected to be seated at the table with clean hands. Especially in the dark, cold winter months, the meal was often a heavy, traditional dish of mashed potatoes mixed with kale or carrots. Your mother would create a small well in the center of the steaming potatoes and pour in the rich, dark gravy. The most absolute rule of the house was that you could not leave the table until your plate was completely empty. You had to eat everything, even if you despised the taste of boiled Brussels sprouts or string beans. There were no alternative meals prepared for fussy eaters. You sat there, sometimes long after the rest of the family had finished, staring at the cold vegetables on your plate. It seemed harsh, but it instilled a deep respect for the food we were given. It taught us that food was fuel, not just entertainment, and that wasting a single bite was a profound disrespect to the effort it took to provide it. Let us consider the rule of taking care of what we owned. In those days, a tear in your clothing did not mean a trip to the store for a replacement. The rule was that everything had to be mended, patched, and worn until it literally fell apart. If you fell on the schoolyard and tore the knee of your corduroy trousers, your mother would spend her Sunday afternoon fixing it. You would hear the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the heavy sewing machine echoing through the house. The next day, you would wear those same trousers, now featuring a thick, stiff patch of fabric over the knee. Socks that had developed holes were never thrown away. They were carefully darned by hand. You could always feel the slightly thicker, rougher thread of the repair rubbing against your toes inside your leather shoes. We wore the clothes of our older siblings, no matter if they were slightly out of style. This was completely normal. It taught us that things had lasting value. We did not live in a disposable culture. We lived in a world where care, repair, and resourcefulness were the ultimate virtues. Another normal, yet somewhat unbelievable rule of our youth involved a very specific type of collecting. Almost every adult male in the family smoked, whether it was cigarettes, pipes, or heavy cigars. The living rooms were often filled with thick, grey clouds of tobacco smoke. For a child, this presented a unique opportunity. The rule of the playground was that you had to collect the beautiful, colourful paper bands that wrapped around the expensive cigars. Whenever an uncle or a grandfather visited, you would politely ask them to save the band for you. You would carefully peel the delicate paper away from the tobacco leaf, making sure not to tear the golden edges. You would flatten them out in heavy books, completely ignoring the strong smell of stale smoke that clung to the paper. We traded them at school, coveting the rare, beautifully illustrated bands from exotic countries. Today, associating children with smoking paraphernalia seems completely absurd and illegal, but back then, it was just an innocent hobby, a way to find a tiny piece of colourful art in the everyday habits of the adults around us. Now, let us bring our memories back to the schoolyard. Do you remember the rough texture of the cold paving stones beneath your knees? In the spring, the entire schoolyard would be consumed by the serious business of playing marbles. It was a time of high stakes and strict rules that every child simply understood. You would carry your precious collection in a homemade cloth bag, tightly pulled shut with a thick string. You could feel the heavy, comforting weight of the glass spheres against your leg. When it was your turn, you would kneel down, carefully placing your thumb behind the marble. The sound of glass striking glass was the ultimate melody of our recess. If you lost your favorite large marble, your prized shooter, the heartbreak was incredibly real. But the rules of the game were absolute. If you lost, you had to hand it over without complaining. Today, children stare at glowing digital screens for entertainment. But back then, our entire world was contained within those swirling colors of glass. We learned about fair play, about winning with grace, and about losing with dignity. Let us listen closely to the early morning sounds of our childhood streets. Long before the sun came up, you could hear the unmistakable clinking of heavy glass. This was the milkman making his daily rounds. The rule was that you had to wash your empty glass bottles the night before and leave them neatly on the doorstep. In the morning, you would open the heavy wooden door to find fresh, cold bottles waiting for you. You could see the thick layer of rich cream floating at the very top of the milk. The bottles were sealed with a thin, shiny aluminium cap. You would press your thumb firmly into the center of the foil, hearing a satisfying pop as the seal broke. The milkman was a vital part of the community fabric. He walked up and down the driveways, carrying heavy metal crates in both hands. He knew exactly what your family needed without even asking. We did not need massive plastic jugs from a distant warehouse. We had a local face, a friendly smile, and the purest, coldest milk delivered straight to our homes. It was a beautiful system built entirely on trust and routine. Do you remember the quiet, cooperative atmosphere of the kitchen in the late afternoon? The rule was that children had to help with the daily chores, and one of the most common tasks was peeling potatoes. Your mother would spread yesterday's newspaper over the wooden kitchen table. She would place a large, heavy pan of unwashed potatoes in the center. The smell of damp earth and raw vegetables filled the air. You were handed a small, sharp peeling knife, and you were expected to get to work. The repetitive, rhythmic motion of peeling away the dark skin to reveal the pale yellow flesh was almost meditative. The dirty peels would pile up on the newsprint, while the clean potatoes were dropped into a pot of cold water with a quiet splash. This was not seen as a punishment. It was a time for quiet conversation. It was the moment you told your mother about your day at school, about your friends, and about your worries. We learned that contributing to the household was simply a part of growing up. We learned the quiet dignity of working together with our hands. Let us recall the freezing winter mornings in a house without central heating. In many homes, only the living room was heated by a single coal or gas stove. The bedrooms upstairs were left to the mercy of the elements. The rule was that you simply had to endure the cold without complaining. You would sleep beneath layers of heavy, incredibly thick woolen blankets that practically pinned you to the mattress. When you woke up in the middle of winter, you could see your own breath hanging in the frigid air. The single glazed windows would be completely covered in beautiful, intricate patterns of ice. But the ice was not on the outside. It was on the inside of your bedroom window. You would scratch the frost with your fingernails, leaving a clear streak to look out at the snow. Getting out of bed was an act of sheer bravery. You would grab your clothes and sprint down the wooden stairs to the living room, dressing as close to the warm stove as you possibly could without burning yourself. It made us tough, and it made us deeply appreciate the warmth of the fire. Think back to the days when communication required patience and physical effort. During the long summer holidays or when someone had a birthday, the unbreakable rule was that you had to send a physical postcard or letter. You would sit at the table with a fountain pen, carefully writing your best cursive letters. You would smell the distinct scent of the blue ink. Once the message was written, you had to endure the terrible bitter taste of the glue on the back of the postage stamp as you licked it. You would walk to the red mailbox on the corner of the street and drop the card through the heavy metal slot. Then, you simply waited. Days or even weeks later, you would hear the loud metallic clack of the brass letterbox flap on your own front door. You would run to the hallway to find a handwritten envelope lying on the doormat. Holding a piece of paper that someone you loved had touched and written upon was a profound experience. It carried their energy, their scent, and their time. A modern text message is instant, but it will never replace the magic of a real handwritten letter. Let us reflect on the incredible sense of community discipline that governed our streets. The rule of the neighborhood was absolute. Every adult had the authority to correct any child. If you misbehaved on the street, if you threw trash on the ground, or if you were disrespectful, the neighbor would immediately tell you to stop, and they would not hesitate to tell your parents. When you got home, your parents would already know what you had done, and they always took the neighbor's side. There was no arguing, and there was no questioning the authority of the adults in the community. Today, if a neighbor scolds a child, it often leads to bitter arguments between parents. But back then, the entire street raised the children together. It created a web of watchful, caring eyes. We could not get away with anything, but we also knew that we were deeply safe. We belonged to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood belonged to us. This shared responsibility gave us a profound sense of security that is sadly missing in the isolated neighborhoods of today. Finally, let us remember the darkest, coldest days of the year, which brought the most magical rule of all. In the days leading up to the 5th of December, the anticipation of Sinterklaas filled the air. The absolute rule was that you had to be on your very best behavior, or you would be taken away in the burlap sack. Before going to bed, you were allowed to put one of your leather shoes right next to the hot stove. You would place a raw carrot or a piece of dry bread inside the shoe for the white horse. Then, you would sing the traditional songs as loudly as you could into the chimney, hoping the good saint was listening on the roof. The smell of the coal fire mixed with the cold winter draft coming down the flue. The next morning, you would race downstairs with your heart pounding in your chest. The carrot was gone, and in its place was a solid chocolate letter, a handful of Croat noten, or a small wooden toy. That pure, innocent magic, born from strict rules and rich traditions, is the true essence of our childhood. It was simple, it was beautiful, and it was perfect. As we open our eyes and return to the present day, it becomes wonderfully clear. We are not just mourning the loss of zinc bathtubs, glass milk bottles, or heavy woolen blankets. We are missing the undeniable feeling of connection that these daily routines provided. The rules of our childhood in the 1970s and 80s may seem absurd to the modern world, but they gave us structure, resilience, and a deep appreciation for the simple joys of life. We learned that the best things in life require patience, effort, and a little bit of discipline. If this journey back in time brought a smile to your face, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. It helps us keep these beautiful memories alive. Now, we would love to hear from you. What was the strictest rule in your household growing up, and how do you feel about it today? Did you also have to eat your healthy sandwich before reaching for the chocolate sprinkles? Please share your personal stories in the comments below. Let us build a community of shared memories. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.